Chair recognizes Ranking Member Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. I want to dig in a little further to this idea of voluntary and incentive-based conservation as an alternative, perhaps. It's been suggested to some of the more prescriptive aspects of the ESA. I think there is this notion that we've heard a few times already today that if we did less of the listing, less of the critical habitat designation, and in fact, we've actually seen some bills to take away those authorities and constrain them, that we could then better support voluntary initiatives. And we've heard some success stories on that type of conservation here today. We love those stories. It's great to see, and thanks for everybody who does that. But Mr. Ash, I want to start with you. Do you think that voluntary conservation efforts alone are going to get us very far down the road with respect to the Endangered Species Act? In other words, if we took away these prescriptive authorities that are the teeth in the Endangered Species Act, what would happen to some of these voluntary efforts that we all want to see?
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. I would start with the, when we talk about voluntary efforts, and particularly incentive-driven voluntary efforts, I mean, again, I'll get back to my main point, that takes funding. So the most important incentive-based programs are things like Working Lands for Wildlife and efforts like that where we're in partnership with the Agriculture Department. It takes funding to drive that. But no, if we think about something like the manatee, one of the key ingredients in recovery to date of the manatee has been reduction in boat collisions. That required a regulation to reduce speeds in areas where manatees congregate. If we had relied on voluntary measures, it wouldn't have happened. You have to have enforceable measures to achieve those objectives. And you assume people basically will comply with the law, and they did in Florida. And we worked in partnership with the state of Florida to enforce those speed restrictions. And so, incentive-based and voluntary conservation measures play a significant role in achieving recovery objectives, but there are clearly instances where they don't work and they're not sufficient.
Thank you. Director Williams, does the presence of that backstop, I mean, we would all prefer to avoid more prescriptive things like listings and designations, but does take enforcements, things like that, do those authorities as a backstop have a beneficial effect in terms of motivating voluntary conservation efforts that can help avoid listings?
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Huffman. I mean, I would echo, in answering that, I would echo Mr. Ash in that voluntary conservation is incredibly important, and it is very much a part of the underpinning of the Endangered Species Act. But the voluntary conservation alone does not get us to where we need to be for so many species. And yes, often when species or candidates are at risk, are declining, there is an incentive to get voluntary conservation agreements in place that provide assurances if that species were to be listed. So yes, I think that the specter of listing can help spur conservation to happen. We'd like to be in the spot of helping species before having to get there.
Similarly, if that backstop did not exist, is it fair to assume that some of these voluntary partnerships might not materialize?
I think that's the case that we have seen over time.
I want to ask about science. Assistant Administrator Coit, it has been suggested in some of our prior hearings in context of several bills we've considered that members of Congress ought to make the call on which species get listed and delisted. And we have a lot of interesting members of Congress. You know, we have dentists and tree experts, and the chairman's a pretty good water lawyer, but we don't have the kind of wildlife science resource capacity that resource agencies actually have. And the ESA was kind of set up to take the politics out of these decisions, wasn't it? Why is it important that we leave these tough decisions to the scientists at these agencies?
Appreciate the question, Ranking Member Huffman. I think a core tenet of ESA is that these decisions on listing should be based solely on the basis of the best scientific and commercial data available, and that is in the purview of the scientific community. And while we ask for input on those decisions, it's essential to the integrity of the ESA that they be made based on science. That's a
Thank you.
core principle.
Yield back.
Chair recognizes Representative McClintock for